Marty Peterson arrived in Moscow in 1975. At the age of 30, she officially worked as a staff member at the US Embassy. In fact, she was the first woman to serve as a case officer at the CIA's Moscow station, and she was carefully selected by the station's then-chief, Robert Fulton. It was believed that the Soviet intelligence would overlook Peterson because of her gender, and it was inconceivable that the KGB would have a CIA agent working to infiltrate Soviet administrations and run shopping malls from within the communist stronghold. Sadly, Peterson had lost her husband just a few years before arriving in Moscow. He was a CIA paramilitary worker and was killed when the helicopter he was piloting was shot down in Laos, Southeast Asia. Sadly, Peterson, overwhelmed with grief, chose to follow in her husband's footsteps, joining the CIA and entering the often lonely and dangerous world of covert operations. The KGB's instinct proved correct. Peterson had no doubt she was a CIA agent, and she was not under surveillance, allowing her to move around and communicate with Russian agents with relative freedom. But she begins to doubt herself, wondering if, despite her precautions, she isn't capable of uncovering the Soviet intelligence story. Peterson's skill will soon be tested when she's assigned to supervise a promising CIA operative, Alexander Ogorodnik, known as Agent Trigon. 2 years later, in 1973, we find ourselves sweating profusely. In a Turkish bath in Bogota, Colombia, a female CIA officer wearing only a towel casually approaches Alexander Ogorodnik. The officer reveals that he knows Ogorodnik enjoys a lavish Western lifestyle and that his behavior in Latin America won't impress her superiors. From the KGB's attempts to recruit him as an informant to his Colombian mistress's recent announcement of her pregnancy, this countryman has had his hands full. But what if he could earn enough money to make all his troubles melt away, and he sets off on a new journey in the West before his Soviet superiors discover that this is what the CIA has offered him: a way out and a chance to start over. All he had to do was work with them, providing them with all the classified documents and information he was privy to through his diplomatic position without hesitation, expressing his contempt for the Soviet regime and his desire to fight for freedom. Ogorodnik agreed to work with the CIA and Colombian intelligence. He had his conditions, of course, which included a generous salary deposited in an escrow account to support his mistress and future child. He also insisted on being allowed to defect to the United States eventually. He then enrolled in an intensive espionage course for several weeks at the Columbia Hilton, where Ogorodnik learned the art of covert operations, prohibited checkpoints, secret writing, photography using a miniature T-50 spy camera, and protocols for dealing with informants. Ogorodnik proved to be an innate and quick-witted learner, while Al-Khwarizmi's work was excellent. He soon realized that the information he had obtained was worthless compared to the vast sums of taxpayer money spent to finance the operation. However, all this changed when Ogorodnik was transferred to Moscow, where he took a position in the World Affairs Department of the Soviet Foreign Ministry. This was a windfall for the CIA, which had long struggled with recruiting agents and informants in the heart of the Soviet Union. In 1974, Ogorodnik and Trigon were just beginning their careers in earnest, while Ogorodnik had yet to reach his highest position. He had direct access to cables sent and received from Soviet embassies around the world. This was an opportunity for the United States to gain a deeper understanding of the Soviets' intentions from within regarding their world policy and efforts to spread communism. However, diplomats returning from international service were under close surveillance by the KGB. Upon their return to Russia, she waited for a cooling-off period of several months before making the first contact. After completing the first handover of informants, Ogorodnik began supplying the CIA with a steady stream of top-secret memo images and planning documents using his secret T-50 miniature camera. By 1975, when Martha Peterson arrived in Moscow, Operation Trigon was well underway. However, the first signs of trouble appeared in 1976 when Ogorodnik failed to send the agreed-upon signals to his superiors in February and March. Peterson's first operational mission in Operation Trigon was to leave a cargo containing a miniature camera, rolls of film, and a letter for Ogorodnik. The package was cleverly concealed inside what looked like a crushed cigarette pack to avoid attracting attention. As always, Peterson was wearing a covert SR-100 surveillance detection receiver, which allowed her to intercept and detect any radio communications from the KGB. None of them were picked up, and as usual I assumed the drop had gone undetected. However, Ogorodnik failed to gather any information. Peterson had to retrieve the package, still wondering what had happened. After a while, the CIA was able to reconnect with Ogorodnik, and another drop was arranged for June 21st, 1976. This time, the package was hidden inside a large, hollow tree trunk, into which were placed 2 fountain pins, one containing a secret miniature camera, as usual, and the other containing something much darker. Before Ogorodnik left Colombia, Peterson asked the CIA for a cyanide capsule for use in the event he was captured and interrogated. Providing an agent with a means of suicide was a difficult decision, and the CIA initially refused the request after Ogorodnik threatened to abandon his mission. Providing Trigon with the lethal pill was ultimately deemed morally wise. The choice of CIA headquarters was also wise. The cyanide cartridge hidden in the pin was fragile and could be easily crushed with a powerful bat, resulting in almost instantaneous and painless death. Peterson placed the device in the designated location, this time in a wooded area. Ogorodnik appeared, grabbed the tree trunk, and left another device behind, carrying a suicide device. The fountain pen undoubtedly made it appear much heavier than it actually was, while the pen provided a measure of safety, knowing that the worst consequences of the disaster could be avoided. What if Ogorodnik had used it prematurely? This fear led him to discard the suicide pen in a moment of panic when he feared. He felt suspicious when he later realized that his suspicions were unfounded. The CIA had not yet obtained a replacement pin. The harsh Soviet winter cast a heavy shadow over Operation Trigon, as direct telephone contact between Ogorodnik and Peterson was interrupted again on January 29, 1977. Direct telephone contact between Ogorodnik and Peterson was interrupted again in the spring and summer of 1977, and it is believed that the phone was hacked, bringing the operation to an end. However, Peterson and the CIA continued their attempts to re-establish contact and succeeded in April. In 1977, when a dead package was sent, CIA technical officials questioned its contents. The handwriting wasn't a perfect match, and the images were inaccurate. They were convinced that the package had been prepared by someone else, most likely a KGB agent. However, the CIA was not prepared to abandon its agent, Gardner Hathaway, who was then the CIA station chief in Moscow and was determined to re-establish contact with. As usual, the CIA sent a message to Ogorodnik via an encrypted shortwave radio transmission. His instructions were that if he was prepared to receive another dead package, he was to leave a small red mark on the Children's Crossing sign on the morning of July 15, 1977. Peterson was on high alert as she passed the secret sign. Mark was there, but something was wrong. The sign was emblazoned with bold cherry-red letters, an unusual and bizarre move for. Suspecting a trap, Ogorodnik reported her concerns to her superiors at the center, despite Peterson's misgivings. It was decided to continue the course abroad. Peterson continued her usual routine in her covert role before returning to the CIA center to review the plan that evening. She then returned home, changed into a disguise, a summer blouse and high-heeled sandals, and, under cover of darkness, attached a CIA radio receiver and earpiece to her clothing. Peterson embarked on a lengthy surveillance operation. She set off on a reconnaissance trip by subway to the landing site, a small stone tower on a railway bridge over the Moscow River. The package contained, among other items, some cash, a miniature camera, and a letter. The letter was placed in a window opening and one of the arched columns along the bridge's walkway. Suspicions were high that the Asian Trigon had been compromised, so the message to Ogorodnik was written in Russian. "Comrade, you have leaked another secret. Take the money and valuables and throw the rest into the river. Forget it, you've been warned this time." After placing the package at 10:30 p.m, Peterson began to descend the footbridge, but when she reached the bottom, 3 KGB agents suddenly grabbed her in a struggle. Peterson is said to have managed to land a powerful kick to the thigh of one of the KGB agents. At the same time, a KGB force ascended to sea level and approximately 12 KGB officers entered the scene. Eventually, Peterson was subdued and searched, her radio was found, and the package was recovered from its location on the bridge. Peterson knew immediately that the operation was over and that Agent Trigon had indeed been compromised. Peterson was taken to the KGB headquarters at the Le Bianca Hotel for interrogation. The spy package was opened and the message was read aloud after a relatively calm interrogation. Peterson was released later that night, as was customary in cases of arrests for espionage during the Cold War. She was declared persona non grata and ordered to leave Russia the next day exhausted. Peterson was devastated and no doubt traumatized. She left Russia not knowing what had happened to the agent she had never met. Over the course of 2 years, she felt she had begun to learn firsthand that the CIA knew Trigon was gone forever. What they didn't learn until later was that Ogorodnik was dead. At least a month before she surrendered the microchip, she was betrayed by Karl Kacher, a Czechoslovakian translator working for the CIA on contract, tasked with translating cables and other messages received by the agency. He and his wife Hannah were Soviet spies who had successfully infiltrated the CIA after years of living in the United States as undercover agents. They infiltrated a large number of agents and informants, and for years they provided top-secret US intelligence to the Soviets. Kacher was eventually captured. In 1984, while serving his sentence in a New York prison, he was released in 1986 in a prisoner exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union. The exact circumstances of Agent Trigon's death remain unclear, but a retired KGB officer provided an account in which he claimed that the investigator provided some details, writing that Agent Trigon was sitting in his apartment at 2 a.m. surrounded by Soviet intelligence agents. This was after he was arrested at his apartment on June 21, 1977. A clarification addressed to the KGB leadership, that is, a confession. Trigon asked for a pen and paper, requesting to use his own fountain pen, which was on the table and had just been examined by a KGB official. The pen underwent a second, more thorough examination before being handed over to Ogorodnik. Ogorodnik began screaming, then began fiddling with the pin. He managed to unscrew the cyanide capsule and swallow it. He shuddered, fell back in his chair, and foam began to come out of his mouth. The KGB office was present. Suddenly realizing what was happening, he tried to pry Olga Rudnik's mouth open with a metal ruler. But it was too late. Agent Trigon was already dead. The loss of Ogorodnik was a devastating blow to the CIA, not only because of the damage to US-Soviet relations, but also on a personal level. The agents who worked with Ogorodnik remotely and supervised his operation felt a profound loss. Martha Peterson was deeply affected by this loss and returned to the United States, where she continued her work. She worked for the CIA until her retirement in 2003. In her 2013 book, Widow's Haven, Peterson recounted her experiences as director of Logorodnik, saying that Trigon died a hero in his own way.